everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling 2 Timothy 4.7. I have to admit, I thought I knew this verse, but getting ready for this deep dive with you, I realized there's so much more to it than I realized.
It's deceptively simple, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, just those few words, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith.
Yeah.
I mean, so powerful, but we've got some amazing sources here, right? Like some incredible scriptural analyses, different theological interpretations. So we're really going to try to unpack what's going on in this verse.
Well, one of the things that makes this verse so powerful is the context, right?
Yeah.
This is Paul's last letter written from prison.
Wow.
He's facing execution. He knows it. And he's writing to Timothy.
So this is like, I mean, we talk about, sort of passing the torch.
Exactly.
This is the ultimate passing the torch moment.
It really is. It's
Yeah.
his last words of advice and encouragement to his young protege.
And one of the things that really struck me, as I was reading through this verse is the imagery, right? I mean, he talks about fighting the good fight, finishing the race, keeping the faith. So vivid.
Right. And it wasn't just, a metaphor for Paul.
Right.
He lived in a time when being a Christian was often dangerous. Persecution, being ostracized by your community, imprisonment, even death.
Yeah.
Like, these were very real threats. And so when he talks about fighting the good fight,
Yeah.
he's talking about something that requires courage and resilience. You have to stand up for what you believe in, even when it costs you something.
Right. Yeah. And I think, for us today, maybe it's not, literal persecution in that same way, but I think everybody has felt that pressure at some point, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like going against the grain, maybe having people disagree with you strongly for something you believe in.
Yeah. And that's what's so powerful about this verse, right?
Yeah.
It speaks to the human experience of facing challenges.
Right.
Of standing firm in what we believe, even when the world around us.
It's trying to tell you something different.
Exactly, trying to pull us in a different direction.
Yeah.
But Paul goes even deeper than that. He talks about this idea of spiritual warfare, this constant battle against forces that are trying to undermine our faith and lead us astray.
Okay, now you say spiritual warfare. That sounds intense. What exactly did Paul mean by that? Like, was he talking about literal demons or?
Well, the early Christians really believed in the reality of spiritual forces, both good and evil.
Uh-huh.
And Paul certainly faced his share of opposition, imprisonment, beatings, shipwrecks, you name it. But he saw these trials not just as physical hardships, but as part of a larger spiritual struggle.
So even when things were going wrong, he wasn't just seeing it as bad luck. He was like, no, this is part of this bigger spiritual conflict that's going on.
Exactly. And that's a perspective that can be really empowering even today.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
When we're facing challenges, it can be tempting to just feel like we're victims of circumstance. But Paul's words suggest that there's a deeper dimension to our struggles, that spiritual dimension where we can tap into a source of strength beyond ourselves.
So it's like those struggles, those battles are actually opportunities to grow stronger in our faith. It makes me think about the second image he uses, I have finished the race. So he's connecting this idea of fighting to the idea of like a long-term journey, right?
Right. Yeah, and in that time, races were often held in large arenas with thousands of people watching. So imagine the pressure, the endurance required, the need to stay focused even when you're exhausted and the crowd is roaring.
Oh, yeah. It's a vivid picture.
Yeah, it really is.
And it speaks to the idea that faith isn't a one-time event. It's a process. It's a journey. Requires discipline, perseverance. I mean, what do you think were some of the things that helped Paul stay focused on that finish line, especially when things were so tough?
Well, if you look throughout his letters, you see that Paul had this deep sense of purpose, a conviction that he was called by God to spread the message of the gospel.
Uh-huh.
And that conviction fueled him, even when he faced opposition and hardship. He wasn't running for his own glory. He was running for something much bigger than himself.
Right. It's like having that North Star, that guiding principle that keeps you moving forward, even when the path gets rocky, right? But he also talks about keeping the faith, which seems different from fighting or running.
Yeah.
It sounds more internal, more about what's happening in our hearts and minds.
You're right. It's a more subtle concept, but equally crucial.
Uh-huh.
Keeping the faith implies an active choice, a deliberate effort to hold on to our beliefs, our values, even when we're tempted to doubt or give up.
So it's not just about believing something intellectually, it's about living it out even when it's hard, and that can't be easy, especially when you're facing persecution like Paul was. What do you think were some of the things that helped him stay so committed, so anchored in his faith, even in the midst of those trials?
That's a great question. And one of the things we see in Paul's life is that his faith wasn't just an individual pursuit.
Yeah.
He was part of a community of believers, people who supported him, encouraged him, and reminded him of the truths he held dear. That sense of belonging, of shared purpose, can be incredibly powerful when our faith is being tested.
It's like having that team of cheerleaders, that support system that helps you get back up when you stumble. It makes me think about the challenges we face today. We might not be facing literal persecution, but we're bombarded with information, with different ideologies, with temptations to compromise our values.
Absolutely. And that's why Paul's words are so relevant. He's reminding us that keeping the faith isn't a passive activity.
Right.
It requires constant vigilance, a willingness to examine our beliefs, to challenge our assumptions, and to make sure that our actions are aligned with our deepest convictions. And that could be a lifelong process, full of twists and turns.
Yeah. So we've got the fight, the race, and now this deeper dimension of keeping the faith. It's fascinating how these three concepts are so intertwined, how they all contribute to this idea of living a life of purpose and meaning.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is how Paul connects these ideas to a deeper theological understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
Okay, now that sounds like a whole other layer of the deep dive.
It is.
I think that's where we need to pick up next time. So join us for part 2 of this deep dive into 2 Timothy 4.7, where we'll unpack those theological implications and more. Welcome back to our deep dive into 2 Timothy 4.7.
You know, it's amazing how relevant Paul's words still are, even though he wrote them centuries ago.
Yeah, we left off talking about how these metaphors he uses, right?
Yeah.
Fighting the good fight, finishing the race, keeping the faith. They're not just about outward actions, but about something deeper.
They really point to this idea of spiritual transformation, of becoming more like Christ.
And that made me wonder, like, what would Paul say about the battles we face in our modern world?
You know, it's interesting because while the specifics might be different, the underlying struggles are probably pretty similar.
Yeah, I mean, we're not facing literal persecution like Paul did, but in some ways, the pressures we face today, they can feel just as intense.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the pressure to conform, to achieve, to be constantly connected. I think Paul would recognize those struggles.
Yeah, it's like we're bombarded with messages about who we should be, what we should buy, how we should live.
Exactly. And I think that's where Paul's concept of spiritual warfare becomes so relevant. It's not just about external forces trying to pull us down, but also about those internal battles we face, like negative self-talk, the comparison game, the fear of failure.
Right. It's about recognizing those inner struggles, those subtle ways we can get pulled off course.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me realize that fighting the good fight isn't just about grand gestures. It's also about those small, everyday choices that shape our character.
That's exactly it. It's about being intentional, about making decisions that align with our values, even when it's hard, even when it feels like we're swimming upstream.
And that brings us back to the race metaphor, right? We talked about how for Paul, it wasn't just about speed, it was about endurance, pacing ourselves for a long and challenging journey.
And remember, in those ancient races, runners had to be incredibly disciplined. They trained rigorously. They denied themselves certain pleasures, all for the sake of reaching that finish line.
Wow, yeah, they had this singular focus, like an unwavering commitment to their goal.
Do you think that level of dedication is even possible in today's world? I mean, with all the distractions we face?
It's definitely more challenging, but I do think that human capacity for focus and discipline is still there. It's about setting clear priorities, about being willing to say no to things that distract us from what truly matters.
And that makes me think about something you mentioned earlier about Paul finding strength in his community. I wonder if having that kind of support system, people who share our values and encourage us to stay on track, if that could be a key to running our own race as well. I think it's crucial. Having a community, a group of people who understand our struggles and celebrate our victories, can make all the difference. They can remind us of our goals, offer encouragement when we stumble, and challenge us to keep growing.
Yeah. It's like having a team of coaches, cheerleaders, and fellow runners all in one. But even with the best support system, there are going to be times when our faith is shaken, when we doubt ourselves, when we wonder if it's all worth it.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of keeping the faith comes in, but maybe in a deeper, more nuanced way than we've talked about so far.
You're saying it's not just about believing something intellectually, but about living it out even when it's hard.
Exactly. And in Paul's writings, particularly in this letter to Timothy, we see that keeping the faith was also deeply connected to a concept called sanctification.
Sanctification. Okay, that sounds like a big theological word. What does that even mean?
It's actually a very practical concept. It's about becoming more and more like Christ, about growing in our character, our love, our compassion. It's about those internal transformations that happen as we live out our faith.
So it's not just about outward actions, but about those inner changes, that deepening of our connection to our beliefs and values.
Precisely. And here's what's really interesting. Paul believed that sanctification is often forged through trials and challenges. It's in those moments when our faith is tested, when we're stretched to our limits, that we have the opportunity to grow the most.
So it's like those struggles, those setbacks, even those moments of doubt can actually be opportunities for spiritual growth. I'm starting to see how all these concepts, fighting the good fight, finishing the race, keeping the faith, they're all connected to this deeper idea of becoming more like
Yeah,
Christ.
you're getting it, and that's what makes this passage so powerful. Paul isn't just offering a set of rules or a list of things to do. He's describing a way of life, a journey of transformation that happens as we face our challenges, stay focused on our goals, and allow our faith to shape who we are becoming.
This is so insightful. I'm already starting to think differently about the good fight I'm facing in my own life. But I'm also curious about something we haven't touched on yet, this idea of an eternal reward. Paul mentions a crown of righteousness waiting for those who finish the race. What did he mean by that?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of what motivated Paul and countless others throughout history to live lives of faith and sacrifice.
Mm.
But to really understand it, we need to delve a bit deeper into the context of Paul's world and his understanding of eternity.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Second Timothy 4.7. Last time we were talking about how Paul connected all those powerful metaphors, the fight, the race, and keeping the faith to something even deeper, spiritual transformation.
Right, and it's that transformation, that process of becoming more like Christ, that brings us to the last part of this verse, the idea of an eternal reward.
Yeah, Paul mentions this crown of righteousness, right? A crown waiting for those who finish the race. It's such a striking image. But I gotta be honest with you, the whole concept of eternal rewards, I don't know, it's always been kind of hard for me to grasp.
I think a lot of people feel that way. It's easy to fall into this crap of thinking about it like, we're earning points for good deeds or something.
Yeah, like some cosmic reward system.
Exactly. But that's not what Paul was getting at.
So it's not about racking up brownie points to get into heaven or something.
Not at all. To really get what Paul meant, we have to think about the context.
Hmm.
Remember, he was writing this letter from prison, knowing that his execution was coming soon.
Wow. Yeah.
And in his world, Roman culture was all about power, you know, earthly power and glory.
So in a culture obsessed with worldly success, Paul was pointing to something completely different.
Exactly. For Paul, the crown of righteousness wasn't about material wealth or recognition here on earth. It was about something much deeper, something more lasting, something that transcended this life.
So what, like ultimate fulfillment?
Yeah, like a recognition of a life well lived, a life lived in service to God and to others. True fulfillment that goes beyond anything this world can offer.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the true reward isn't something you get after you die. It's something you experience in the process, right? Like in the very act of living a life that's true to your values.
You got it. And I think that's a message that resonates even with people who don't necessarily share Paul's beliefs. I mean, we all have this desire to live meaningful lives, don't we?
Yeah.
To make a difference in the world, to leave it a little better than we found it.
Right. Like we're all searching for that crown of righteousness in our own way, whether we call it that or not.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the reasons why this verse, even though it was written so long ago, still speaks to us today. It taps into something fundamental about being human, that longing for purpose, for meaning, for something that goes beyond just our everyday existence.
Wow. This has been such an incredible journey. We've gone from unpacking those metaphors of fighting and running a race to like exploring the depths of spiritual transformation and a meaning of eternal rewards. I feel like I have a completely new understanding of this verse.
Me too. It's amazing how much depth and wisdom can be packed into just a few words.
It really is. And it just goes
Hmm.
to show you that even these ancient texts, they still have so much to offer us today.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Hmm.
We've talked a lot about Paul's journey, his struggles and triumphs, but now it's time to turn the lens inward.
To think about our own good fights.
Exactly. So I want you to ask yourself, as you go about your day, what are you battling? What goals are you striving for? And how are you keeping the faith in the middle of it all?
Ooh, those are powerful questions. And remember, listener, you're not alone on this journey. We're all in this together, fighting our own good fights, running our own races, trying to live lives of purpose and meaning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Keep seeking, keep growing, and keep the faith. And keep diving deep.